whatever reason that you're here, I think what we're hoping to do for this short amount of time before you guys get started is kind of a little bit more nuts and bolts and really some of the things that people might not think about on a regular basis when you're selecting an AMS, because we know it's all about features and functionality, and that's super important, and you're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of days. But there are other things that happen that people might not think about going into it, and I think expectation setting is super important at this point. So I'm going to kind of coach along and Gretchen in terms of asking questions and letting her talk about everything that she's run into, because she's kind of dealt with really little organizations all the way to really huge organizations and run into so many things over time. So Gretchen, and I'm going to also have Reggie participating and jumping in at any point. We haven't
tried to escape.
Yeah, we haven't rehearsed this, but there are a couple of things that I want to have that I've asked Gretchen to show as we're talking about this, but this isn't about a PowerPoint at all. It's mostly about a conversation. So Gretchen, you were talking to me the other day when I was asking you about this stuff, and I think we can distill down like a successful AMS experience deals with 4 main factors. And you want to go into that a little bit in your mind?
Yeah, we were talking, there's lots of different selection criteria, and like you said, features, functionality, project management 101. But the 4 that mattered, depending on, it doesn't matter what size your organization is, it's the people, both you and your vendor partners, it's the processes you're trying to bring forward or change, making decisions, that's especially important during a selection, and then setting yourself up for a successful implementation. So like those are the big ones.
Let's talk about the people part of it a little bit. So, and I know the Reggie is actually famous for saying things like, hey, if you hear or know something that's going on, do something about it, right?
Right. So I think one of the very first things to do is to start to get to know the vendors that you're dealing with and all the partners, and start talking about how are we going to know when things are going well, how are we going to know when things aren't going so well, and we'll talk about this more during the implementation phase, but just laying the groundwork of figuring out what all the personalities are. And there's some just basics that I want to show really quickly. When you start to talk to your team, it's like, what do you need? People start talking about, I need a better process, I need a better member experience. It's like, but what do you as an individual person on the team need? And so I think that's where you need to start. One is workload. What are you doing right now? One of my ASA colleagues told their team to cut 20% of their work for the year just to give them some headspace. And when you implement any new system, that's something that leadership needs to help people with. You can't just add a selection of any kind and hope for success. And then you need to figure out all the personality types, which, you know, Loretta, I'm famous for saying, like, what's your learning style? Are you an introvert? It really matters so that you're communicating with people effectively. So there's 2 tools that everybody has heard about. I'm going to share my screen for 2 slides if I can figure this out, because Reggie wouldn't let me rehearse. All right, let me share real quick. One of them is just talking to stakeholders and saying, what do you need? How do you want to stay informed? And so this is something as simple as, if you're in a Zoom meeting, you turn on your annotate button and you say to people, put a star where you want to be kept in the loop. Do you want to be really informed because you have a really high interest in this project? Do you need to just have a little bit of contact because you want to be informed, but you don't need to know every little thing? So this is a simple thing that anybody can do right away, and just say, where is everybody? I would repeat this too with your vendors.
Gretchen, when does that come into play? Like, when does not doing something like this bite you in the process? Give an example of that.
Like right away. So even if you're doing selection like demo days, if you haven't met with your core team and said who needs to do what and when, some people might say, well, I wanted to know about that. How come anyone didn't tell me so I could go? And other people would say, why are you having me go to this? I don't know what this has to do with me. I'm just going to stay informed. So it could start today.
Okay, good.
And then the second one is just knowing, again, this is another communication. This is a RACI chart that I print out and keep handy. And this one has an S in it for support. And so I like this model. So again, this is just something, don't overlook who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted. And this is important kind of in the middle of a selection as you're starting to make decisions, so that you don't have the entire staff trying to help.
Gretchen, we've got a question in the chat. It says, how do you manage people understanding they are not RA, but CI?
They're not RA. All right, say that again. Don't ask me a complicated question.
I know. How do you manage people understanding they are not RA, but CI? And Reggie's laughing in the background. Reggie, I think you should put the video back on.
All right, responsible and accountable, but not consulted and informed. So I think this is just literally about setting expectations and educating people. And so you can't just print this out and go, okay, everybody, here's a RACI chart, learn about it. You really have to live it. You have to practice. If you're responsible, you have to say, what does responsibility mean? Define it. Just like your system requirements, you have to define what they mean and put them into context. So I think that's what's really important with a lot of tools, including project management tools. If you don't put them into practice and you just read it and you don't really personalize it for your organization, it's not helpful.
But it's an interesting question though, because they're saying
Great one.
They're not responsible and accountable.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I was laughing because I've seen too many organizations get to the middle of their project and realize that they didn't do this. Mm-hmm. And so everybody, you get in the middle of the project and everybody wants to have control, if you will. So I think, and I think you said it, that this should happen at the beginning. And this really needs to have executive support, whatever mm-hmm. your management team is. They need to support, they need to see that chart and agree on that chart ahead of time, and then make sure that they stay true to it throughout the process.
Mm-hmm. And this is another one where if you should have a project manager role. It may not be a full-time person, but you need to give that person both responsibility and authority. So you can't just give someone out, say, hey, you're in charge of the project, but you're not allowed to make any decisions. You can't spend money. You can't, advise anyone what to do. That's a really serious conversation that leadership needs to have with the project management team and the core team.
That happens a lot though, too. It happens to us when we're called in to do project management too, because you're kind of held responsible, but you're not given authority in certain cases.
Right.
So that's not a great combination.
No. So that's a problem no matter what size your organization is, just throwing titles around and not putting them in the context of your organization. And it's also a really bad habit to go, that person's really smart, they can handle it. I'm busy, just go deal with it. And it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. It says, can you please reiterate the top 4 criteria you mentioned, people, processes?
Oh, decisions and setting up your implementation plan.
Implementation, yeah.
I mean, there's the 5 Ps about people, process, purpose, product. You can pick acronyms that work for you, but these are the ones that I think are universal when you're shopping for new products.
Yep, absolutely. You ready to move on to process?
Sure.
So you say this, I've heard you say this before, Gretchen, plan for the best, expect problems.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think it concerns me sometimes when people start talking to vendors when they're looking for a new AMS and they bring their entire basket of complaints and they just say, I want all of these things to go away. And they don't focus on what they're trying to do. So I think it's really helpful to enter into any new project with the expectation that you're going to be successful, but that's going to take some compromise from people. And so I think that's the expect the best part, that if you go in with this saying, this is what my business is, this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm open to change it, then expecting the worst is when you hit the process that's very personal to somebody and they start, their reptile brain turns on and they're like, oh no, Reggie can change, Loretta can change, but my process is beautiful, don't touch it. So I think that's what you need to prepare for.
I think too, though, that I think what you said kind of hinted to when you started speaking about this is people come to the table thinking that a new AMS is going to solve all of their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing could be farther than the truth. It's kind of like you've got a lot of business process issues that you need to deal with ahead of time. You have a lot of cleaning up to do ahead of time. People aren't going to be happy at the end of the day because you're going to be asking them to change their comfortable process that they have. And their comfortable process might be that they keep a list on their spreadsheet and they trust it and they know it, but be kind of mowing over them going through this process. So at the end of the day, some people's new process is going to be more difficult than their old process used to be.
Yeah.
I think that the kind of the good of the order message needs to come from the top down throughout this whole process, because not everybody's going to be happy at the end of the day.
Right. And the person who should be the happiest is no one on staff. The person who should be the most satisfied are your members and your customers. And so I would also tell people, you need to expect that you're going to have to do a little bit more work to have a cleaner member process. And that's a big debate you're going to have is what is the level of pain that some people may have to encounter to have a really clean join process or a really tight registration where people don't abandon.
Yeah, I think that it's shifting away from, do you agree with this, Reggie, that it's kind of shifting more away from our internal processes to the CX for the client, for the customer experience?
Absolutely, Loretta. I was getting ready to raise my hand so you guys would call on me about that. You know, I think that anymore, given the varied experiences that your members are having in other places in their lives and other systems that they use, it's important to know what their expectations are. We're in the process of looking at all of our infrastructure right now, and we shifted away from a traditional requirements analysis to figure out what our systems need to doing a customer behavior study.
Yeah.
And if we can't get requirements out of that, if we can't look at what our members need us to do and be and come up with requirements, then shame on us, because that's why those systems are there in the first place.
And what's kind of interesting to me is for the last 10 or 15 years, mobile first, we would never tolerate a really steppy, difficult project on a mobile device, your iPad, your phone. You would just get rid of it. But people will tolerate it on a larger screen, which is, it's really interesting to me. So I think that is catching up, though. That's how people, and that's what we say, if there's a tiebreaker on a decision, which one is better for the receiver? And some processes are internal, and they do need to be more efficient for finance than membership. So whoever is the biggest customer, that's a good way to make things a tiebreaker without it being personal.
And I know you guys said this earlier, but we've got to get in our heads somewhere that our internal systems can't break the member experience. Everywhere else in their lives, people are registering with one click, and people are filling out, smaller and smaller forms of information. And oftentimes I see us get stuck. For example, I'll give a great example. When attendee registration happens, I look at a lot of organizations, including ours sometimes, registration process, and realize that everybody looks at that. This is where I can get all the information I need about any individual. So registration pages end up being 8 pages long as opposed to, 3 or 4 questions long. So make sure you separate out things that are not germane to the user at that point in time from all the other stuff you might want them to do.
Well, Reggie, I was listening to a podcast series on OKRs after the session with Juan and Tim, and I thought this is a great Reggie term. So when you're setting up your outcomes and key results, it said you can write a beautiful outcome, you can have fantastic key results, and then you ask yourself, so what?
Right.
and if you can't answer that may be your answer. But again, when we were talking about alignment with leadership, this is where it touches that again, because leadership needs to say, we're willing to give up something to have a better experience. Because sometimes the biggest data hoarders are leadership saying, we need to do more analysis. We need to figure out what's going on with people. And that just may be an inefficient use of time. And then the other people who are getting squeezed right now is finance. So as we're decentralizing and doing the best of need or best of breed. Transactions are going to live where people are making them. So in a virtual event registration system or in a learning management system. And it is finance who is starting to raise their hand and say, this is really difficult for us. So you got to be aware of that because you need to know how much money you have. It's very important.
Where else do people get stuck in relation to process?
I think people get, I think there's a lot of friction between marketing and finance. Those are the two high touch users. People spend a lot of time with membership and membership processes. They spend a lot of time with event and event processes. But I think the friction points are those two groups who like to have a lot of information and they can spin up a reason why they need to have it. So Reggie, when you were talking about just creating the end story, I think virtually it's hard to try to figure out what those requirements are. And we're used to having whiteboard sessions where we can write it out and then draw lines for each other and scribble it out. And I'm a visual learner. So if you say, what do you need? It's harder for me than if you start walking me through a process and say, where do you get stuck? Or what is your brain doing now? So
the concept of the picture tells 1,000 words you want to show.
Yeah. And there's a lot of tools and Reggie's like, just pick one, but there are many. So here's a baby one just to start. It's called Jamboard, and this is free. It's with Google, and it's just an online sticky note. And this is very helpful where if you're starting to write down your process, you can have everyone log in who's part of the conversation. And I would not have any more than 6 people at one time when you're breaking down a process, by the way. And then just write if we're talking about a registration process or trying to communicate with people, you color code it. These are the people we're trying to find. This is the action we want them to take. And then here's a potential problem. And then you can move these around or have a discussion about one of them. So instead of saying the create account process is broken, what about it is a problem? And so when you start with something like this, it's simple, it gets you out of your own way, and you can start identifying, well, really the real barrier is duplicate information. You have the same person in there multiple times. So that drives marketing crazy because they're sending out too many messages. It makes finance crazy because people are logging in to get the member rate, but they signed in as a non-member. And then you have to figure out is that really a problem you need to solve? So the next thing people will do is they'll say, oh, we found bad data or missing data or duplicative data, and they immediately want to fix it. And I think during a selection, you need to ask yourself so what? Is it worth it? So this is just a very simple tool.
So Gretchen, at what point do they start using something like this? At what point in the process?
So sooner the better, I think. So because when you go talk to vendors, like today in demo days, a vendor is going to say, what problem are you trying to solve? And people just start spouting off, I need to have this and this and this. If you've started to lay it out a little bit with the core team, like Reggie said, what are the essential things that you need to do as a business? Using one of these tools with the core team starts to get their process going. Like Reggie was saying, what do you want the member to do is maybe one set of sticky notes, and what are they actually doing, which is another set. And so that just makes you an informed consumer.
Reggie, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was two things. One is, I would add a third sticky. Gretchen, you said, what do you want the member to do? What are they actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
What do they want to do?
Oh, yeah. Forget what I wanted.
Third sticky I would add to that. The second thing is that if between the two of you, if you can highlight for the audience, what do you see as the biggest sticking points in the process? And the reason I bring that up, Gretchen, is you brought up the data thing. And so many people go through this process. I'm getting ready to get an AMS system, and halfway in between, they start trying to clean up their data. Well, your data is your data. It's the data you got. So you can't stop there and stop that whole process to do this data cleaning thing. But if there's other sticking points like that you see often, be good for folks to hear.
So once you move beyond sticky notes, like Visio is something that's, or again, there's Miro and Mural and all kinds of workflow tools, but I would move sticky notes into workflow, which is this. Well, I lost my share. Here it is. So this is tiny. This is an eye chart, but this is just a visual example of when you're starting to unpack. So you start with something basic. What are we trying to do? Get all your ideas on the board. And then I think it's very helpful to say, this is our current process of what happens to people, you know, as they're starting to go through a process. If they make a decision, they go on this path, and then this is something we need to focus on because it's difficult. This is where we're seeing some abandonment. So then this is what we want people to do in the future. And then the yellow are decisions. So just by saying, here's what we're doing now, and here's what our goal is, and you add a third swim lane, Reggie, of what do we want the customer to do? This picture, one, it helps staff clarify, yes, in fact, that is what I want to do. And then it helps your vendor see what you are trying to do, because a lot of people use industry words that are everyone in their association knows, but the vendor is learning an entire new language. So I think this just helps everyone get literally on the same page.
So this is when organizations are like really trying to dig in deep, because the sticky notes are kind of a surface level, kind of you visualize. And this is when you want to dig deeper and actually document and really show somebody who doesn't know much about what's going on in the association, or what needs to happen.
But again, you can't bake you are still shopping. And so there's two things I think people are tempted to do when they're in the selection phase. They're trying to make a decision. One is what Reggie said. They see data and they're like, oh, this is perfect time to clean up our data. No, it's not. The second thing people try to do is figure out what the solution is. So we figured out what we want people to do. We figured out what they say they want to do. So during the selection, staff members start going into solution mode. Well, this is what we think the process should be. And then you're upset because you formed this new picture in your mind that you're starting to get mentally attached to. Then you choose a vendor and they say, what? They're like, no, you never do it that way. You should do it this way. And then people are like, oh, but my new process that I've already thought is fabulous is being criticized.
Yeah, so another, you were asking about sticking points, and I think that's the exact one that I was going to talk about, Greg, is we get organizations coming to us saying, pick a new AMS, but first we want to redo our business processes. And we say, well, that's probably not a good time to do that, right? Because you're redefining your business processes now when you don't know what your systems are going to be. And you're going to be in an awkward position of having the vendor bring best practices to the table that you're not going to be able to take advantage of, because what's the point in redoing your membership dues renewal process today when it's looking different potentially because of your new system down the road?
Right.
I think that people need to let their system define some of the things that can be changed.
Right. I was just going to say that there are some, if you know that your financial management system is ancient and it won't support anything new, of course, you're going to have to address that and change it. If you know that you are wanting to start organization memberships and you don't have any of the organizations and the people linked together, no system is going to solve that. So that's data cleanup that you could do now. So if you're saying, we want to do a new model of membership that requires some extra setup, and we're going to have to do it anyway, you may decide to do that in your current AMS because people are familiar with it. It may be a good time to just do some of that type of cleanup, but wholesale across the whole board, I would say wait.
You know, you guys mentioned something and you said it, and I want to make sure that people heard it. You know, most of the AMS vendors have helped hundreds of organizations with different business processes. So if you go into this process thinking that any one of these systems is going to do anything exactly the way you currently do it, you're wrong. I think you have to be really open and focus on what's the end goal we're trying to get done, not what are the 15 steps we have in our minds right now that it takes to get it done. As long as that system gets it done in a way that's acceptable to you, that should be fine. Gretchen, you had that chart back. Pull that chart back up for a second with the steps in it, if you will.
Oh, my Visio?
Yeah.
The eye chart?
Yep, the eye chart. One of the things also that I'll say is that you need something like this that spells out scenarios, so that when you go into a demo, you're looking at specific scenarios. You're not going into that demo wide-eyed and coming out of that demo with a whole different mindset based on what the demo was. Mm-hmm. No, the demo needs to do your business. And so if you've got these scenarios, my strong recommendation is that you send kind of a script, if you will, or a scenario list, if you will, to the vendor ahead of time so that they can show you how these things get done in their system.
Yeah, and I would do the new process, not the old one.
Yes.
So tell them where you're trying to go.
Yes.
But the other thing I would challenge is we say this a lot, and we mean it, about don't customize, follow baseline, follow the vendor recommendation, but there's a little however in there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So as talented as many of the teams on any vendor, AMS, LMS, FMS, pick an MS, they're still very technical. And so there is still a lot of work to be done in our industry, I think, Reggie, about usability and design. And so it's still okay to challenge your vendor to say, I know you think that's technically the cleanest way to run a process, but the usability of that is awful. And then you'll get into again, be prepared, right? The vendor is going to say, well, you said you want to be baseline. That is true, I do. But I also can't have again, we're using online join button that's so teeny and it's a link on the bottom right of the page that is not useful. So it's okay and expected to negotiate with your vendor about what is baseline. And in many, many cases for your high risk, high volume processes, to spend a little bit of money adding some either advanced configuration that's going to take a little more love and care, or a single customization, not ripping apart the entire process, but one or two to really make it shine. And that is a very fine line, because once you break the plane, it gets easier to open up. But I think, again, that's a leadership discussion. We're going to have some customization, but it's going to be very, very specific to solve very specific problems.
Yeah, and I think what you were going along, what you were saying, and I don't want to get any of the AMS vendors riled up, of course, but
sure we do.
Based on what you were just saying, some organizations think it's so important to have a certain process in place or a way that you're doing something. If it's a universal enough situation, the vendor will negotiate with you, I think, as you were alluding to earlier, to change that in their baseline, and the association is paying for it. Okay, because at the end of the day, it's a win-win, because the association gets something that's built into baseline, they're funding it, but they're going to be able to be supported going forward. So think about that too.
Right. And that's where I think it's really important, like you're talking about when things happen, Loretta, like as soon as you choose the vendor, and even as you're choosing the vendor, if they have a user community, I think that's a really important criteria to look at, especially now that, there's been so much consolidation, that a user community can really help inform what the roadmap is going to be. And that's where you use the power of your colleagues to say, we used to do this when I was at the Optical Society with ASHA. We had a lot of similar processes. So we would join up and challenge each other behind the scenes. And neither one of us had the perfect process, but both of us together were like, oh, that's cool. And so a couple of us that were power users of a particular area, we worked together and we negotiated these 5 associations who all did the same thing with the vendor to say, we're all willing to change these 8 or 9 if we can make the product better. And I think that's an important thing to think about.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you're talking about it that way, Gretchen. When we have some of these hard conversations, the the community kind of shudders a little bit as if we're bad-mouthing vendors or either we're bad-mouthing customers, and we're not. We're all in this together. If people make these products better, then all of us suffer. So having these open conversations makes sense. If you guys could talk a little bit about configurability. It must be Monday morning. Versus customization and the danger of getting off the upgrade path for a product.
So some people say, if we don't customize at all, we're going to be fine. And they make the craziest configurations known to man. They use every nook and cranny. That can get you off the upgrade path as fast as 2 good, solid, paid customization. So configuration is, I'm using the system to set things up, and I can do it upside down, but I'm still using the baseline system. And then if the vendor extends that product or makes it different, your crazy, complex, rigid process will break. So this is tricky, and where I think people need to stop. So, you know, when they tell you, when you get dressed in the morning, if you're all glammed up, take one piece of jewelry off. I think it's the same thing when you're trying to configure your system, especially when it's new. When you get to a certain point that's good enough, pause and try it. And I think the other thing we recommend, Agile is another topic that we can get into that's very hot, touchy point for me. But I think having an iterative mindset, Reggie, gives you permission to grow into customization or grow into advanced configuration at the right time. So the other thing I suggest to people is start with a baseline mentality or a medium level of configuration complexity, and know that there's a couple things you're going to have to do manually, but you're new to the system, you're a rookie, and the vendor doesn't know you very well. So the other thing I like people to do is plan, like 6 or 9 months after launch, go back and say, okay, now we know. This is where people are getting stuck. This is where we should invest our money. So I think you should set aside a chunk of money, and you still go live, you still go into support, but you plan to come back when everybody's more educated. And then I think you have better results.
And some of the vendors don't do customization at all. So the vendors that tend to be more, you know, for the smaller organizations, the SaaS type products, et cetera, give you some level of configurability. That's something that people should evaluate.
Right.
You know, how far can I take the product without needing to go into customization?
But people are creative, right, Loretta? Like, even though they might buy a product where there's no formal toolkit that you can extend it, people figure it out. So they'll go find an app that they like. You know, there's a lot of connectors now, and they just do it themselves. And that can be just as dangerous, where they'll say, well, the AMS system didn't do what I wanted it to do. I was told no. So fine, it's free market. I found this app, and this app, and I bought Zapier that's super cheap, and I wired them all together.
Right. In that mode of thinking, that's absolutely correct. But then you can go into the Reggie mode of thinking too, the best of need, which is, so you find an application that does, you know, 75–80% of what you need to do. There are other ways for you to handle the things that it doesn't.
Absolutely.
Right. And so don't panic just because you can't afford a $1 million system that's highly customizable. Find a system that meets the majority of your needs and go outside.
Right.
That's an option too.
So Loretta, somebody wrote in the Q&A, they said not all vendors have issue with customization and upgrade. So I think that's true. I think
a lot of vendors love it. They love it for some wrong reasons. And I think a lot of the vendors are coming out of that mode now.
But I think there are good reasons too. So I think that's the thing that people have said, no customization, stay baseline, it'll protect you from the upgrade path. I think people need to really be more, I think I would love to shift the conversation to say, start using the product in the most fundamental way, give yourself a chance to learn it, give the vendor a chance to learn you, and then go to the next level of sophistication. That's where I'd like to see the discussion go. So. And then like Loretta said, be open to, we thought at the surface during our shopping time that this piece of functionality would work well within in the AMS we were looking at. And then you come to the point where you're actually configuring it and you may have made a mistake. So that's another communication of, you might have to have a tough conversation with your vendor to go, let's call it. Like, it looked good to both of us at the time we were doing these detailed demonstrations. We gave you a scenario. It looked great. Now we're here and it's not so great. Be willing to go find a partner to integrate rather than try to hammer in, I paid for this, so you're going to give it to me.
Yeah. We've got a couple of other, go ahead, Reggie.
No, I was going to say, I was thinking back to when I first implemented an AMS system and how it was the ecosystem. And now we're in a time and place where it's part of the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you guys give people in thinking through that? How do you right size what this thing called an AMS is in today's world?
It depends. Again, I think it goes back to draw a picture of everything. So once you do some of your process mapping, then you need to do some system mapping. Is what are all the assets we have available? And this is a small association, medium, large. And then which ones are performing well and which ones aren't. And I think having that conversation as you're looking for a new AMS, you say to your AMS vendors, here's my world. This product is great for me. I love it. It works perfectly. This one is okay. Because you may choose an AMS that has 50 features, but you're going to use 25, and that's fine. Because those 25 are amazing.
Yep.
So it's a conversation. There's no right or wrong answer. But I think the openness to saying we are willing to make adjustments along the way is the way to success.
Yeah, I think that it can get complicated in the other direction, especially for smaller organizations now supporting multiple systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that I still think if you can get a system that meets a good part of your needs as, as an AMS, great. But don't feel forced
right
everything in that system. Just use built-in integrations with external systems. Take advantage of the integrations that the vendors have already developed, right? Look down that path. That's sometimes why we say don't get your content management system after you've picked your AMS, because a lot of them have integrations built in with certain content management systems. So it lessens the complication there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about decisions. So
this is what I was going to say. This is where analysis paralysis sets in right now. So we have a core team. They're great. We've put some requirements together. We've met with vendors. They've shown us how their system works with our scenarios. We think 2 of them are fabulous. And prices are competitive. They're like almost a tie. This is where people go into analysis paralysis mode and they start picking them apart and going, well, this one is slightly better with an integration with this vendor. But however, this one's reporting tool is slightly better. We need to have more demos. We need to have another meeting. We have enough to have another call. And when you start saying that to yourself more than twice, the core team has to come back together and say, so what?
Pick one.
Pick one.
Right.
Yeah.
Not everything can be a priority.
No. And some people say you can only have one priority, like, when you're doing Agile, only one thing can be number one. But I think you could have a set of the top features, but not 100. And there is no perfect system, but there is one that's a solid B+, A-, and an A+ in certain areas, but just stop it. But the minute you start getting into that doubting yourself mode and backpedaling, that is something you need to say it. That's a leadership call too. If leadership is getting regular reports and things are moving quickly, and then people stop and are like, well, we need to do a little more research. We need some more time. That's a leadership job to say why.
Yep.
What's going on? Come on, let's talk about it.
Yep.
Where do you think that step is, Reggie? Where do you see people getting stuck, or Loretta?
Yeah, you can go ahead, Lo.
I think so I have this train of thought of thinking about how people gravitate towards certain vendors, and frankly, and this, like, don't you see this happen where they're doing demos or whatever, and they gravitate towards a sales team and they really like that one company. And so sometimes decisions get really blurred. I just wanted to make sure to point that out.
Yeah.
We have our clients establish selection criteria. Selection criteria typically has the really prioritized functional requirements as part of that. But then sometimes people try to start migrating towards vendors. They like the vendor, they like the way the product looks. And even though I do think culture is really important, because you've seen that time and time again, that certain companies work with certain types of organizations and certain types of people and certain cultures. So I don't want to discount the importance of that, but at the same time, kind of reel people back in and really take a look at what your selection criteria was and try to be effective about it.
Yeah.
You know,
Hey, Loretta, Mark Sedgley's pinging us that we're at like 12 minutes to go.
I know. So we've got some things to cover here. So
do you want to do a speed implementation and then give about 10 minutes for questions? Does that work?
yeah, let's just do quickly. So implementation, bringing good habits with you. You've got, otherwise implementation is where the wheels can really come off. So let's talk about some of the really key things here. Gretchen, you want to get us started?
Okay, so I'm a tactile kinesthetic learner. This is once you choose a vendor and you start implementation, there's some things that will trip you up right out of the gate. So the first thing many associations focus on is data conversion. We have to get our data conversion perfect. And you can burn enormous amounts of time. So I think, again, when you reset your project team, when you're implementing and you have now your vendor as part of your team, you need to go back to that RACI chart, go back to how people want to work together, establish escalation points between leaders and project managers and project managers. So you're starting to scan for warning signs right away. And then you say, what are the most important things for this project? And so what I like to have people do, again, is write them down and say, is it data conversion, member experience, customer service, flexible pricing, personalization, detailed financial information? Pick the top 15 and then let half of them go. So if all and start to focus.
Yeah.
Because one organization having flexible pricing is critical for everything else. Another organization, personalization is the gateway to so many other things. So I would say write them down so that you gave it a voice, and then get rid of half. That doesn't mean you're not going to do them. They're just not in that first set of really, heavy duty planning. Would you half it again, Reggie? Do you think half is too?
No, I like it because invariably you're going to get to a point where you got to make a decision, and if you haven't prioritized your needs, then you get stuck in that churn place. Mm-hmm. So you have to prioritize those things.
Right. And as a little bit of a CYA for everybody, Delcor recommends in your statement of work, as you're defining what a vendor would deliver, how you're going to work together, in my mind, is a deliverable. Mm-hmm. I think you should write it down. Here are all the people's roles and who's going to be their buddy. This is our change management system. This doesn't have to be a heavy form intensive. If you want to change, you have to submit a form. It has to be approved. But you have to have some process that you agree to internally, and your vendor and you agree on what that is. That will prevent so many headaches downstream.
Gretchen, what are some of the signs that the project is on a good path, on a healthy path as we're going through this?
So I think a healthy path is people are talking to each other and they're debating things and they're kind of fussing at each other a little bit, but it's heading in the right direction. Like they're not arguing for the sake of winning. It's arguing for the sake of a good project. I think that's good. Things are moving on time. Not every deadline is being hit, but people are able to recover and adjust. I think that those are all good signs.
What about negative signs? When's the train starting?
I think when a project gets too quiet or too loud.
Quiet.
So if all of a sudden your chatty group of people just starts going, fine, whatever, just do it. And you see this, that's a problem. Because that means you've somewhere, or if you have a pretty quiet team, they're introverts and they are just chugging along heads down, and you start hearing a lot of bitching and snarky comments, but there's nothing specific, like nothing's broken, but you're hearing a little jab here and there or too much noise. You need to do some listening, and sometimes you just need to stop and say, what's going on?
The other thing too is, of course, this is an obvious one, right? Things aren't going well when the vendor's not delivering, or the vendor's delivering and they're not delivering well. However, there's the flip side of that, which is also that the staff is not delivering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People don't think about that sometimes. It's not always the vendor.
Right. So that's what I mean. If things are going well and then they're not, I think the other thing people assume is, oh, this is a rough patch, we'll get over it. And that's true. Like, but if that rough patch is more than a week or 10 days and you're not getting back into your rhythm and you feel like you're forcing your way through it. So again, a vendor is going to have a delivery cycle that's not stellar. Okay, did you recover? But like we said, is that 4 or 5 in a row? Whoa. Like, pick up the phone, call somebody, say, what's happening?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it could be that a vendor is going through a lot of change, and they need to be honest with you, the client, and say, you know what, we've got 4 or 5 deliveries in a row and they're going to be rough. You should just power down and do something else, and we'll pick you back up in a couple weeks. And that might blow a timeline. People are like, no, we must launch on this day. So,
Roger, you were going to say, I can tell you want to say something.
No, I'm listening and just being thoughtful about organizations really figuring out what their organization's pace is and when's a good time to do this process. That's what I'm thinking about is we too often get ourselves caught in this place of, we need a new AMS, let's do it now. Well, you got an annual meeting coming up, you got strategic plan coming up, you might have 15 different things. Figure out the time when you have the time and have that conversation with your proposed vendor ahead of time so that everybody's aware of all of these little things that throw projects off. And organization is one of those things sometimes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to look at when you're looking at your time commitment is some of the process requires more time at certain times, right? So kind of figure that out, because there are kind of lulls and dead times.
Yep.
So kind of figure that into it at the beginning. Look at the schedules. When would you ever be able to do demos? When would you never, there's no way we can take time to map our processes out because we're preparing for the annual conference. Right. So you have to look at it that way, because there's never really a good time.
I'm saying there's never a good time. And I would say, when you identify the worst time of year for your organization, the absolute worst time, you should plan that your vendor and you are going to launch that day. I would plan for that. Like, the schedule is going to look beautiful. And then a couple things shift, What happens if it shifts into one of those critical times of year? What are you going to do?
Right.
Like, you may launch anyway and say, it's just going to be terrible and we're going to launch and it'll be fine. And we'll just launch do like a soft launch and we'll catch up on the other side of the annual meeting. Or you may say, if we get to August and we miss the date, we don't want to, but we might have to pause and pick it up in October. We're not going to try to gut our way through because we'll ruin it.
Gretchen, what would you say, just gut, what would you say the percentage of projects that come in on the time that they were actually supposed to? I mean, it can't be zero, but zero, that's harsh.
Yes, it can.
Being harsh now. That's not true.
I think, okay, projects that come in on time are the ones that go in with a little bit lighter touch. So it's the people who are willing to say, we're going to go in with the medium level of configuration and we're going to pick up more as we go. I think those have a higher rate of coming in on time. People who try to kitchen sink it and say, we cannot launch until all 50 things are ready, that's when the timeline gets blown up.
We only have a few minutes, so if you guys have any questions, please post them. I really want to read this comment while we're waiting to see, though. It says, it's kind of funny. It says, it's like deciding to have children. There will never be a good reason. Always a reason to do it, select an AMS, that is, but there's so much upside to committing. That's so true. That's right. So
that's the perfect way to end it, right? There's never a good time.
Absolutely.
That's right. Do we? Yeah. So you guys are about to embark. I mean, for those of you who are actually looking to select, and this is a great way for you guys to get introduced to a bunch of different systems. Thank you so much, ASAE, for doing this. I think it's a way to, great compact way for people to get familiar with a bunch of vendors and products. And it's not an easy process. There's a lot to think about. Know that it's not going to be easy. It's tough, right? So,
right. And I would ask associations to be candid with your vendors and really tell them what you're trying to do. And then I would ask vendors to give me some space to make a decision. And if I say, you know, I need a couple weeks, give me a couple weeks. Yep. and start building those things. Oh, we have a question. Yay.
When you have to listen, what do you listen for? What constitutes a bad day, or why don't staff deliver in your experience?
One day you can't, that's not fair. But if you see a pattern emerging where one of the people that you really rely on is highly agitated or just checked out, you need to call them 101 and say, what's happening? I don't think we're checking on each other as much, especially now with this 100% remoteness. Teams who always were remote had that culture built in to check on people and kind of feel when they were having a tough day. For those of us who were mostly in the office and we'd hear the kitchen chatter, we could read people's body language, we're missing that. And so I think it's even more important now to say, are you okay? Like, what's happening? I think that's one way to listen. And then staff don't deliver because either they're getting, like Loretta was saying with timing, you had your finance person and now they're in the middle of an audit and they can't because you've hit their busy time. It could be that they're stuck, you know, that they're trying to configure something, they're working with a vendor and it's just not clicking with them. So they're in this weird holding pattern and they're feeling frustrated, they're feeling stupid, they're aggravated. Those are the two that I see.
Yeah, and just know that when you've got, just really be on the lookout for one person potentially who can set the whole thing going in a negative direction, frankly. Right? It's kind of Chicken Little. Everybody has Chicken Littles, and they can do a lot of detriment because this is a long process. Communication, we didn't really speak a lot about this. This is an obvious thing. It's key. People need to hear from you. This is a long process. You're asking them what they need. You're spending a long time with them. You're showing them products, and between that time and go live is a long time. Right.
And it's just a beginning, right, Loretta? It's launch is the beginning of a relationship that you want to nurture and take care of. So have fun shopping and be specific about what you're trying to do. And I would say just have your so what flag, right? Like give yourself permission to make some changes.
Reggie, thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a lot of fun talking to you guys. Yeah. Good luck to everybody.
Well, thank you guys for being here. I think, you know, we covered some of those not so obvious things that people need to be thinking about during this process. So thank you. I can't thank you both enough for being here, and we'll see you soon. Okay.
All right. Happy Monday. See you in the demos.
Bye.
Bye-bye.